This is Maximus Aviation.
Well, nothing lasts forever, especially giant buildings in space that have been orbiting the Earth for more than 25 years. Of course, I'm talking about the ISS, or the International Space Station. However, not only has the ISS reached the end of its operational life in space, but the Russians have already said they're going to be abandoning the ISS in 2025. And the US has bigger designs in space, particularly around the moon. So the time has come to put the orbiting astronaut B&B out of its misery. The first piece of the ISS was placed in orbit in November of 1998. The ISS took years to build and required a total of 37 U.S. space shuttle flights, as well as 5 Russian rocket launches for the station to be completed. The first crew arrived at the space station in November of 2000. And over the last quarter century, more than 270 astronauts and scientists have visited or lived at the ISS to help construct the station and perform scientific experiments and medical research, and more recently support the various commercial space ventures that are occurring there. Still, fond memories aside, NASA plans to retire the ISS in 2030. And although the ISS is the largest space station built to date, it's also expensive to operate and keep in orbit. But more importantly, the technology aboard the ISS, while once considered state-of-the-art, has become outdated and antiquated. And frankly, NASA and its partners never planned for the ISS to last forever. So NASA is now planning to send the outdated ISS back to Earth in a blaze of glory, literally. But in order to do that, NASA had to figure out exactly how to bring the ISS down safely and make sure it didn't land on your house. So NASA considered several options. One was to move the ISS to a higher and more stable parking orbit where it could effectively be mothballed without a crew. But without humans to maintain the station, the hardware would likely begin to break down and progressively fail. Plus, in a higher orbit, the ISS would inevitably decay and come falling down to Earth anyway in an uncontrolled re-entry that could pose a risk to people back on Earth and, like I said, possibly land on your house. And NASA also considered other options such as dismantling the ISS in space, but this would have been extremely costly. Plus, without a shuttle anymore, bringing the pieces back to Earth was an impossible task, so that option was out. So the only realistic option, and the option NASA finally went with, is to deorbit the station and let it come down through the atmosphere and crash safely into the ocean somewhere. Deorbiting a spacecraft or space junk can be either controlled or uncontrolled. For example, the first U.S. space station, the Skylab, crashed back to Earth following a largely uncontrolled deorbit in July of 1979. However, an uncontrolled deorbit is cheaper, actually pretty much free, but runs the risk of impacting population centers, potentially hurting people, or damaging buildings, and yes, even your house. And some of you old dogs like me may remember some of the Skylab pieces landed in Australia. But luckily, no one was hurt. But a controlled deorbit would allow the ISS to be brought down to Earth at a time and place of NASA's choosing, creating the lowest possible risk to people and infrastructure. This is the option NASA has chosen. And given its large size, roughly the size of a football field, the ISS is likely to be brought down over a broad area of the South Pacific Ocean, far from any inhabited areas. But how exactly does NASA plan to bring down the football pitch-sized ISS? Well, most of you probably already know, but the same way they're going to bring back Butch and Sundance from the ISS in February of 2025, with Elon Musk's SpaceX. SpaceX was awarded an $843 million contract to build the Dragon deorbit vehicle to send the ISS to its doom. And SpaceX is already hard at work souping up their Crew Dragon to drive the old ISS to its fiery grave. And hoo boy, SpaceX's new vehicle to bring down the International Space Station will be a monster. The SpaceX deorbit vehicle, a variant of its workhorse Dragon spacecraft, will carry 46 Draco thrusters to send the International Space Station to its end in the South Pacific Ocean in 2030. And 46 Draco thrusters is triple the usual 16 on-board Cargo Dragon missions to the ISS. The vehicle's design will build upon SpaceX's Dragon cargo spacecraft with an enhanced trunk section that will contain propellant tanks, engines, avionics, power generation, and thermal hardware tailored to complete the mission. SpaceX said the vehicle will fire between 22 and 26 engines at the same time. The contract calls for a speed of roughly 57 meters per second. That's 187 feet per second. That's just over 127 miles per hour, or 205 kilometers per hour. Providing that kind of turbocharge will take a larger Dragon and a one-off design especially for this mission. The trunk section that provides propulsion, electricity, and other vital items will be twice as large as the standard cargo Dragon trunk. SpaceX said the modified Dragon needs a ton of propellant and a ton of engines to provide a lot of thrust to push the ISS out of its orbit. There's also a number of complexities that come with actually pulling off a mission like this. However, providing that kind of turbocharge will take a larger Dragon, a one-off design, especially for this unique mission. The trunk section that provides propulsion, electricity, and other vital items will be twice as large as one on a standard cargo Dragon trunk. SpaceX said the Dragon needs a ton of propellant and a ton of engines to provide the thrust needed to push the ISS out of its orbit. And there's also a number of complexities that come with actually pulling off a mission like this, a SpaceX spokesperson said. One example is it has to continually operate in a different environment that we're used to operating, while pushing the ISS with all of its appendages at the same time. Its increasing drag on both the ISS and the Super Dragon is due to Earth's atmosphere. As I mentioned, the South Pacific Ocean is one of the prime locations for the ISS, although NASA has not yet decided exactly where it will finally come down. However, most of the chunks should safely burn up in Earth's atmosphere. The goal is to distribute the debris over a narrow path of more than 1,250 miles or 2,000 kilometers, using the very large thrust and very hefty burn that SpaceX's vehicle will provide. What survives re-entry will highly depend on its construction, NASA says, but calculations suggest that pieces will range in size from household items such as microwave ovens to typical sedans. Some things will completely burn up like solar arrays, they said. Other very dense structures or structures that are kind of buried under structures can survive. The timing of the historic burn is expected around January 2031. But the end of the ISS doesn't mean NASA's finished living in space permanently. Far from it, because the demise of the ISS just opens the door to a new chapter in space condos. The next big space station project for NASA is the Lunar Gateway, which will be smaller than the ISS but more complex. But instead of orbiting the Earth, as its name would imply, it will be orbiting the Moon. The Lunar Gateway is designed to serve as a crucial stopover for long space missions, set to launch its first modules in 2025. Gateway will be the first space station to orbit the Moon. The project is a collaboration between NASA, the Canadian Space Agency, the European Space Agency, the Japanese Aerospace Agency, and Mohammed bin Rashid Space Center. Building a permanent settlement that orbits the Moon will allow astronauts access to the lunar surface and opportunities for more extended missions, according to NASA. To this end, Gateway will have multiple docking ports for spacecraft, areas to live and work, and labs for scientific experiments. To get the Gateway into lunar orbit, it will be sent in pieces similar to how the ISS was placed in low Earth orbit. Two of Gateway's modules, the Power and Propulsion Equipment PPE and the Habitation and Logistics Outpost or HALO, will travel to the Moon aboard a SpaceX Falcon Heavy rocket. The pieces will take about 1 year to reach their destination in orbit, which will take the station around the Moon once a week and provide ready access to the lunar South Pole. During this time, the modules will conduct data on both solar and cosmic radiation in the lunar environment, which will have long-term impacts on astronauts and their equipment. Because it is in lunar orbit, Gateway will be exposed to more radiation than the ISS, as the ISS was protected from much of this radiation by Earth's magnetosphere. Once PPE and HALO are in orbit, another piece will travel with the Artemis 4 crew. The Lunar International Habitat, or Ihab, will provide a place for astronauts on the station to live during their stay. Gateway will also support a robotic arm called Canadarms3. The device will assist astronauts during spacewalks and provide a way to move Gateway modules, repair the station as needed, and snag visiting spacecraft. Gateway will be smaller than the ISS, at about 1/5 the size of the Earth's orbiting station. Gateway will measure about 141 feet, 43 meters, about 62 feet, 19 meters, and weigh in at about 139,000 pounds or 63,000 kilos. Fully assembled, Gateway will be smaller than the ISS at about 1/5 the size of the Earth orbiting station. Gateway will measure about 141 feet or 43 meters by 62 feet 19 meters and weigh in at about 139,000 pounds or 63,000 kilos. At its fastest, Gateway will orbit the moon at nearly 2 miles, 3.2 kilometers per second. Early on, the station will have enough space to accommodate 4 astronauts at a time. Unlike the ISS, Gateway will not be visible from Earth because it will be about 1,000 times farther away from our planet. Astronaut crews will hitch a ride to Gateway on NASA's Orion spacecraft. So that should be pretty cool, huh? Fireworks show when the ISS comes down. And if I'm still doing this crazy job in 2030, I'll be sure to live stream the fiery demise of the space station. But until then, I'll be here waiting to read all your interesting comments. But as you know, I won't know until you let me know down below. And until next time, yeah, this is Maximus.